Good afternoon, everybody. Well, rather like Dr. Sloan said, last year the challenge that I found when writing my speech on international developments was, as others were trying to do, was to attempt to predict the outcome of the US elections. This year it's actually knowing where to start. The title of this year's event is Brexit Innovations and International Standards. However, I propose to reprise that as Disruption, Diversity and Dependency. It seems to me that disruption is all around us, but I'm not going any further with references to songs than that. I note that my prediction of last year of a snap general election was correct, though I have to say I'm somewhat less heartened by the consequences of it. Brexit was just a start, and of course, since then, we have had the election of President Trump, the king of disruption, but perhaps as a property developer, that is somewhat to be expected. And, of course, he is by no means alone. President Macron's election in France, who, together with his party La République En Marche, achieved outstanding success in France, essentially coming from nowhere in around some 12 months. We'll have to see where President Macron goes next as he attempts to assert his presence, firstly within the EU, as Deputy Trott alluded to, and secondly as he attempts to build his party towards the elections in 2019 for the European Parliament. Whilst President Macron is more pro-business than perhaps any recent French president, he is nonetheless a very loyal European, and his election, along with the re-election of Mrs. Merkel, does not necessarily bode well for all the negotiations that are upcoming, although, of course, stop press, let's see where Mrs. Merkel actually ends up. There could well be a second German general election this year, and it's not even clear whether Mrs. Merkel will be leading her party into that. And so I think that will play an interesting role, depending on the outcome of how Germany is developing with the whole Brexit negotiations. Also in Europe, we have seen some perhaps more concerning results in the Austrian elections, and in a different and yet somewhat surprising manner, the interference of the democratic process in Catalonia. Not, so far we believe, actually Russian interference, but it seems that cyber attacks were reportedly undertaken by the Spanish state itself on the Catalan electoral roll to delegitimise the poll. Further afield, we've seen the continued standoff and perhaps playground name-calling between the United States and North Korea, although moving to an even newer level, this weekend it was reported that North Korea are now looking to build ballistic missile submarines, so let's see where that goes as well. Finally, in its own way, China has created some disruption through the Premier this time not in fact naming a successor and thereby interrupting the 10-year cycle to date of changes to the Chinese leadership and creating the expectation that he will seek a further term from 2022. I think that it is possible now to say, as we did following 28 in respect of financial services markets, that in the political sphere, disruption is the new norm. The trouble is that whilst we've seen these disruptive elements creating pressure waves in public opinion, it is difficult to discern fundamental changes to the way in which things are done. After all, disruption is the lifeblood of developing successful businesses as opposed to delivering good government. The job of government is a more tried and tested path, perhaps aided by service level standards and the odd postcode lottery to encourage the system to improve. Turning to diversity, it is important that Guernsey looks to ensure that innovation is at the forefront of its mind. You've heard the Director General talk about the steps that have been taken in the last 12 months to have, for example, the establishing of the Private Investment Fund and also the Lending, Credit and Finance Initiative that is exploring areas from electronic platforms to green financing initiatives. These have also come about because the Commission sees it as important to provide a climate that is conducive to financial services innovation. It's important to remember that a regulator is here to regulate and not to promote. But there are areas where a regulator, simply by being open, engaging and available, can assist a jurisdiction's overall perception as a good place to choose to do business. And that such a state of mind is not mutually exclusive with its role to regulate. At this point, I would now like to pause and provide what perhaps some of the younger members of the audience might call a download from Jacob Cherry, the Commission's Senior Regulatory Advisor in Hong Kong.
from Hong Kong. Behind me across a small stretch of water is Hong Kong Island itself, and within that the area known as Central, which is its financial district. It is some of the tallest skyscrapers in Southeast Asia, and yet the island upon which they stand is exactly the same size as Guernsey. Whilst Hong Kong has been around for some 180 years, its present-day ethos is Chinese and is built on a tradition of 3,000 years of Chinese history. In this context, Guernsey's heritage of some 800 years of independence has more than some respect. My name is Jacob Cherry. I'm the Senior Regulatory Advisor based in Hong Kong, working for the GFSC. My role involves providing regulatory feedback to new applicants on proposed license applications, reporting back to the Commission on significant market developments within the region, providing technical input and thought leadership on Guernsey's specialist industry and regulatory framework, and maintaining the Commission's good working relationships with other financial regulators in the region. Guernsey's fund structures are receiving greater attention from the Asia-Pacific region. There is considerable sophisticated cross-border funds expertise in Asia, notably in Australia, Japan, and South Korea, and increasingly in China and Thailand. Hong Kong and Singapore are regional hubs for introducers arranging cross-border funds where the assets or investors are located in Asia-Pacific. The desire amongst Asian investors to diversify their holdings is driving the use of cross-border fund structures for investments into alternative asset classes, particularly into real estate in Canada, Germany, the UK, and the USA. The private fund offerings introduced by Guernsey, Jersey, and Luxembourg are gaining attention in Hong Kong as the industry looks for alternatives to Cayman's exempted fund. Interest in alternative domiciles is being driven by rising awareness amongst Asian fund promoters and managers of international norms regarding jurisdictional substance. The opportunity that I perceive for Guernsey's industry in relation to the One Belt, One Road initiatives is in providing specialist alternative asset administration to fund structures that are sourcing capital from European investors. While hubs like London and Hong Kong are looking to provide the fund management and are encouraging their industry's management firms to increase their exposure to these risky long-term investments, Guernsey may be able to plug a gap to improve the overall efficiency and soundness of any related cross-border investment structures. A similar case can be made for Guernsey to play a larger intermediary role in the green fund sector. Guernsey's industry may be able to lend credibility to the governance of investment structures that aim to finance green initiatives in Asia in order to attract those European investors that have a lower appetite for geopolitical risk. Of all of its financial sectors, China's insurance industry seems the most bullish about the prospect of greater competition in the domestic market by international players. In international markets, the cross-border transfer of client data is a new challenge to these firms. China's new cybersecurity law has not reduced the burden of compliance with cross-border data protection legislation that internationalizing Chinese insurers now face. By contrast, reinsurance is relatively underdeveloped in China, and most of its reinsurance market players are foreign-owned. The Chinese government is now offering subsidies to domestic reinsurers to encourage the growth of this sector. The China Insurance Regulatory Commission imposes a 200 million renminbi minimum capital requirement on the major stakeholders of all domestic insurers in mainland China. This capital requirement also applies to parties wholly owning captive insurers, so there is considerable appetite among those firms that are able to use offshore domiciles that have more proportionate capital regimes for captive insurance. Guernsey appears to be the only credible Western captive centre that is proactively targeting these Chinese firms. Introducers in Hong Kong are receptive to the messaging that many offshore jurisdictions are highly compliant with the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. But knowing this fact, they are often less discerning of the differences between individual offshore jurisdictions and will steer their clients towards those with the lowest compliance costs. Guernsey PLC's messaging that one of the island's structures can provide greater peace of mind than those of many other international finance centres is very gradually beginning to gain some traction amongst sophisticated clients. Most top-tier firms are not offering structures for the avoidance of CRS reporting, as Hong Kong legislation includes provisions to criminally prosecute trust and corporate service providers that advise on how to avoid tax or avoid reporting tax. Some of the smaller firms in Hong Kong are still prone to bow to the pressure of a Chinese client to select a domicile for the avoidance of CRS reporting. Many of these firms are expected to exit the Hong Kong market with the impending introduction of an AML licensing framework next year. The aircraft registry has provided Guernsey plc with an entry point to attract clients to related financial services. This has gained a high level of attention in Asia. Guernsey's attraction to the Asian marketplace as a small, joined-up jurisdiction is that our industry can collaborate to build packages that are tailored to meet multiple financial needs of a firm in a given industry sector. Chinese tech firms are actually leading by many measures in their application of data analysis to the financial services sector. Due to the amount of direction that both the technology and the financial services sector receive from the Chinese government, there is little worry about the disruption of the banking sector in China. The technology firms already service the retail and small-medium enterprise sectors, many of which were previously unbanked, but they have not encroached on lending to the larger corporates, which remain the preserve of the state-owned banks. However, it's important to note that the space between the technology firms and the banks is shrinking. The private client sector is comparably underserved in Greater China, and this market is much less developed than in the West. Many of the innovations that are receiving attention are intended to eventually bring down the cost of offering wealth management products to private banking clients with less disposable assets. The focus is not on private banking as a people business, as it traditionally has been in Europe and the USA. Hong Kong is a significant regional hub for Asia-Pacific business across all sectors of the financial services industry and retains its unique position as a gateway to and from China. As Chinese markets continue to slowly open up further to international trade, Hong Kong may come to be superseded by mainland cities in its importance to Chinese firms and investors. But most expect that, due to its history, demographics, quality of living and sophistication, Hong Kong will remain the major jumping-off point for international firms looking to develop their interests in China. I am now receiving 2 or 3 cold calls per week, and it has been expressed to me by a Hong Kong market participant that whilst Guernsey was not on anyone's lips here some 12 months ago, now our financial services offering is being widely discussed across all sectors. So if you're planning to visit Hong Kong, my contact details are on the screen. Thank you for listening.
Well, I hope you found that informative. For me, and perhaps for those of you who visited Hong Kong, I must admit, and perhaps you've seen it from the outtakes there, I do still find it hard when standing on Hong Kong Island with the skyscrapers, the flyovers and the metro system to take in the fact that it is actually exactly the same size as Guernsey. I hope, however, that Jacob's piece has given you an insight into some of the work that is being undertaken in Hong Kong. Amongst the large amount of technical detail there, Jacob did make an interesting point on cross-sectoral working, possibilities in relation to the aircraft registry that perhaps the fiduciary and the insurance sectors would be able to collaborate on providing a complete bespoke solution. And also that builds on the point made by the chairman in his speech. I can tell you that Jacob has established good contact with the 3 British consulates for South China, Hong Kong and Singapore respectively. They also see opportunities for Guernsey businesses in the region. I would also perhaps suggest interaction with the British Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong, whose remit stretches beyond Hong Kong and into China itself. I will leave Jacob's contact details up there for you. To turn then finally to dependency. And by that I mean international standards and our dependency and interrelation with them. We depend on these for our place at the international table, and indeed, quite rightly so. Guernsey is a highly credible jurisdiction, and when subject to international assessments, whether by the International Monetary Fund or Moneyval, has achieved results that leave most of the onshore world behind. Now, where we are going next, of course, is to ensure that we continue to meet and develop international to meet international standards. And for this, we have the Revision of Laws project, which again, as the Director General mentioned, is progressing. We have had the draft enforcement law out for engagement, and we are working our way through the sector laws. The banking law will, I hope, shortly be available for engagement on a fatal flaws unintended consequences basis, and I would encourage all sectors to look at that law. The reason I'd say that is because it contains the definitions in respect to supervised persons, etc., that will then spread across all the sector laws. So I would encourage everyone to look at it and not just say, oh, that's the banking law, it's not for us. Thereafter, we will hope to have the protection of investors law and then the fiduciary law to follow. These draft laws are part of us ensuring that we meet international standards by keeping our laws current and fully functioning pieces of legislation. The last few weeks, of course, have seen the international finance centres as a group centre stage in the news. And there will always be those in the media who are able to find the borderline case to illustrate a point. However, I think we have all noticed the extra amount of caveating in the news reports, stressing that they're not actually alleging anything is illegal. Of course, they fail to mention the fact that the hack itself was illegal. You might wonder why I choose to speak on this topic at this event. Well, because I think it's important that we face it, and because it links straight back to the international standards point. Firstly, that we must continue to ensure that we meet them. Guernsey's future depends on this being understood. In turn, industry, and perhaps with some grumbles, no doubt, is here reminded of the importance of following the rules and guidance that the Commission issues, but more from the Deputy Director of Enforcement shortly. Secondly, merely being a recipient of international standards is not enough. Guernsey, however, can and should, as the Chief Minister did, remind the international community of the high standards that Guernsey holds itself to, and in proposing and leading the work to create an international standard for the regulation of trust and corporate service providers, where there was nothing before, allows us to remind the world of our leadership on the international stage, a position acknowledged by EU officials and understood by the Financial Action Task Force. It is also perhaps for us now to say more loudly to others in the onshore world that it is time for them to move to adopt the regulation of trust and corporate service providers. For, as the FATF's own research has shown, in jurisdictions where trust and corporate service providers are regulated, there are lower instances of anti-money laundering and terrorist financing. So, to conclude, we have seen a period of disruption, but don't expect it to go away any time soon. But please note that Brexit is in fact only a small part of it. Diversity will allow Guernsey to develop, and dependency on international standards and following the rules is very important for Guernsey's future. Thank you for listening.